nice adventure with a fat man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Flood City. Yeah, okay. So, Flood City starts with a conversation I had with Mary the other day. Right, she's been reading this book here. It's called Reminiscences. All right, so it's called Reminiscences of Baltimore by one Jacob Frey here, and here he is. All right, and so this book was written in 1893, and I think it's interesting that its catalog number was 6632.01. And you can't, you really just can't make this stuff up. All right, and so Mary had been reading this book, all right, and thought I would be interested in this, for obvious reasons, I think. All right, and so Jacob Frey here, in part of his reminiscing, he was a policeman. All right, and so I'm going to read from this, and we're going to talk about Baltimore, the city of floods. I was captain of the South District at the time that the Great Flood occurred. Everyone who was old enough to remember compared it with the flood of 1837, which swept away all the old bridges and damaged many houses. But that former visitation could hardly have done half the damage that the later one did. The four floods that Baltimore has experienced within the present century have all occurred between the earliest part of June and the later part of August. The one in 1817 took place on the 23rd of August. That in 37 on the 14th of July. And he actually has this date wrong. I lost I don't know how long thinking that there was no record of the 14th of July flood in the Baltimore Sun. But he's remembering this wrong. It happened on the 14th of June, 1837. All right, so that means the flood of 58 that he talks of next, which happens on the 12th of June, was almost 21 years later to the day on that one. Right? And the last one, the one he's talking about here, was on the 24th of July. And so now at this time, the publication of the book is 1893, so I'm thinking this is something that just happened recently in his life. Right, but he continues, right, that during the week preceding the storm, the weather had been excessively hot, the thermometer ranging as high as 101 degrees in the shade. The storm must have commenced a little while after midnight or in the early morning of the 24th, judging by its effect and from the reports made in the morning. But the heaviest part of it certainly did not occur till about 8 o'clock in the forenoon, and I love that the morning is forenoon to him. And even then, few people comprehended what was in store. The first intimation I had of any flood was when I went to the marshal's office to report at the usual hour. The marshal's office was opposite the present city hall. The water was several feet deep on the floor when the captains arrived. Judge of our astonishment to find that all that part of the city was flooded from the overflow of Jones Falls, which had swollen in a very few hours to such unusual proportions. As there was no danger along the Patapsco, which, being a much greater stream, did not respond to the cloudburst as readily as Jones Falls, we of the Southern District were called upon to aid those in the flooded section. I'm going to use this map here of 1851 to illustrate what he's talking about here. Okay, and so now, when he means the Patapsco is no great threat here, he's talking about the northwest Patapsco here, right, which comes in and forms the Inner Harbor, right, and its other tributary, Middle River, which goes up into what was today would be Patapsco State Park. And so the Southern District that he's talking about, that he comes from, right, is this area over here, right, and all into what today would be Federal Hill, and then out into Locust Point. This is all South Baltimore. Right, so he's called in to help out the flood of Jones Falls, and so Jones Falls is this river here. They call it a stream, but it's really like a small river. Right, so it comes down from Baltimore County and feeds down into the city and empties into the northwest Patapsco. And they call this Harbor East today. And so now essentially Baltimore City, you have to understand, is and this is one of the things that's appealing about Baltimore City and the mud flood, is it is a deceptively hilly town. All right, so now when you're coming from the Inner Harbor, it's relatively flat here, right? It's pretty flat to the harbor. But just a few blocks to the north, there's a pretty steep pitch, right, up to the top of Cathedral Hill here. All right, so the thing about this hill that downtown Baltimore is that slope, when it slopes downwards towards Jones Falls, it does so like in steps. All right, and so the top of it is the cathedral over here. And now when I was doing my King of the Hill at the earliest part of the pandemic, I took some pictures and video that I think really illustrate this well. And I'm here on Saratoga Street. But this is the Episcopal Church here. Not quite at the top of Cathedral Hill. All right, and I'm at the side of it here, sloping down. All right, and this is Charles Street going up. Charles Street kind of continues up on this kind of angle here. I'm down at the bottom. I'm here. All right, and then it kind of levels off for a bit, and then it drops down again, and it levels off for a bit, and it drops down again, right? And this is all carved out this way along that stretch, this. And so when the Jones Falls floods, this area down here, which is really close, sort of acts like a basin, right? And this whole area floods out, going down into the harbor. Right? And so what he's talking about when he's showing up for work, and I don't know where he's coming from, if he's coming from South Baltimore over here, when Frey shows up for work, he's showing up down around this area here. And he's already saying that the water is several feet high. Already, a great many people had moved or were moving their effects to a place of safety, for the weather-wise said that a south wind and a heavy rain portends mischief to those who live near Jones Falls, right? Because they had just experienced this 21 years earlier and, 20 years before that. So this is the second time in 40 years, right? But we found plenty to do of work for ourselves and employment for the boats. And now you have to think, this area is flooding standing water. And so now this area at the time he's talking about already has standing water of several feet deep, according to him, right? And they're launching boats. And that's what we're going to see about this story. They're launching boats out all over the place to collect debris and save people. And this is their job during this great flood. Right? There were all sorts of property afloat. One who has not seen a flood of this kind can form but little idea of the various kinds of goods and chattels that get adrift at such a time. Everything that would float was on the move. The water overflowed into Center Market first, then into Swan and Hawk Streets. And so now here's Jones Falls coming down. This is the Center Market, right here. So the water's flowing up from Jones Falls and out. It rose rapidly about noon, pouring into streets which had previously been safe and endangering both life and property. A car on the Gay Street line crossed the bridge and met the torrent at Saratoga Street, when it soon floated from the track. Driver and conductor got the horses unfastened and escaped by swimming them. The passengers, not able all of them to get out of this strange arc, I love that, strange arc, were carried down Harrison Street with it. Some of the occupants managed to climb out and save themselves by clutching at awnings and stanchions. But when the car was finally overturned, it carried with it several people who were drowned. And so now, this is where he's talking about this happening. This is Saratoga Street. Again, the hill is here. It's stepping down into this basin area. Jones Falls here, filling up with water. The bridge here, the carriage with this horse-drawn carriage is met with a torrent and turned over, and people are just getting pulled along with the water and having to catch awnings and I guess like lampposts, I guess stanchions. I don't really know what a stanchion is. Right? But this is happening here, and they're getting washed down Harrison Street with the current. A great deal of our work lay at the intersection of Baltimore and Frederick Streets, and in such places as that, where the torrent rolled like a river. The scene near the Maryland Institute beggars description, for there seemed to be the principal dumping ground for debris of all kinds. As a collector of curiosities, the flood proved itself without an equal. Roofs, barrels, dead animals, bales of manufactured goods, furniture, vehicles, pieces of bridges, and all manner of wreckage were deposited in a great heap in front of the Institute building. By one of the strange, unaccountable freaks of nature, the flood had protected the Maryland Institute from destruction by building a barrier against its own fury. And so now the Maryland Institute building is here. All right, Jones Falls coming down. just off the Inner Harbor here, this being Pratt Street, there's a series of markets. This is the Center Market, which he was inundated first, he talks about, right? And they're long city block warehouse type buildings, right? And so this is the Maryland Institute. And so what he's saying is that, the floodwaters are coming and they're carrying all this debris, roofs and everything, and it's catching at this city block and diverting the waters kind of like around the market and kind of creating its own like little dam here. A striking feature of this inundation was the way in which a new volume of water seemed to rush from some unexpected quarter like a tidal wave, and as the people fled from it, it would suddenly send a tidal of backwater in a new direction to cut off retreat. One may form some idea of the tremendous force of the water when it is recalled that entire houses were carried away bodily in one or two cases and wrecked in midstream. The site of the city hall was a lake, Holiday Street a river, Marsh Market Space, Frederick Street, Gay Street, and many others were cataracts, or rather sluices through which the streams roared and rushed, threatening and overturning and sweeping away. Telegraph communications were destroyed so that I had not been able to exchange intelligence with my district. But at about 5 o'clock, a messenger arrived to tell me that the Patapsco was up and my presence needed there. It is needless to say that I hurried over as fast as possible and found that it was as stated. The larger stream had at last risen and was doing its best to emulate the destructive work of Jones Falls. Fortunately, it had Light Street Bridge to beat against it in some measure, and against there it kept piling up wreckage of every conceivable kind. Much of the property was valuable, and this we saved to a considerable extent and restored to its owners. It was reported that one Harrison, the bridgekeeper, was secreting a good deal of the drift that came his way, and an investigation proved the truth of this. Harrison was arrested and considerable property recovered. A miserable sight was presented by the lower part of Baltimore after the water receded, and the full extent of the damage became apparent. Certain localities were hardly recognizable, since all that belonged to them seemed to have been carried away, and a heterogeneous mass of rubbish from somewhere else piled in its place. Street pavements and sidewalks were torn up, and great gullies appeared, which in some cases paving formed a mere shell which the water had undermined. Not only in the city, but throughout Baltimore County, the damage done was terrible. There was not a bridge that was not more or less damaged, and in most cases they were either carried totally away or else rendered unsafe or impassable. All right, so he wraps up his flood story here, moving on to the next chapter, but what an incredible story, right? And so Mary and I had just read this over coffee yesterday morning, right? And we're like, when was this? So we knew the book was 1893, so I started Googling Baltimore floods 1890s, nothing. Baltimore floods 1880s, nothing. Because again, he looked like a younger guy. Right? So I ended up just Googling, Baltimore floods. Right? And this Baltimore Sun article came up from 1993, floods we've known. So I'm reading along, right? And, it's talking about these floods, 1817, 1837, 1858, all the floods that Frey talks about. But then it says, the worst catastrophe, even worse than Agnes, probably occurred in 1868. And then it doesn't talk about any floods again until 1972 and that Hurricane Agnes. So I said to Mary, I think it was this 1868 flood. And she immediately said, the Carrington event. And the thing about Mary is that she's really into solar weather, right, and sun weather and things like this, right, and how it relates to the natural catastrophes that we experience on a cycle, and also tying it into the ancient sun god worship of the Canaanites and those earliest religions, right? And so now the Carrington event, right, was a powerful geomagnetic storm, September 1st and 2nd, 1859, during solar cycle 10. All right, so a solar cycle, or solar magnetic activity cycle, is a nearly periodic 11-year change in the sun's activity measured in terms of variations in the number of observed sunspots on the solar surface. Sunspots have been observed since the early 17th century, and the sunspot time series is the longest continuously observed, recorded, time series of any natural phenomena. And so now, I'm not going to get that deep into it, the whole solar weather and space weather and things like this, because I'm not sold on what the sun is, as I was talking about a little bit in Mastered Reality. And if the sun is behaving in these kinds of ways, I believe it's because the sun has been programmed to behave in these ways, or these are a function of the sun's programming. And I don't know, is it coincidental that all these observations of sunspots and this solar weather all starts at the same time? But the idea of a sun simulator or something like that fits very neatly into the Mud City paradigm puzzle tree, and its varied branches, But whatever you think of the sun, they definitely present a correlation to these sunspot activities and weather cycles and things like that, right? And so Mary is very much a part of this. And so now it's interesting that these cycles go in about 11-year spans, and then you look at the timelines of these floods, 20 years here, 21 years here, almost like a double cycle goes through, and then a flood happens, right? But then from 1858 to 1868, that's only one cycle, right? Kind of like it, had a pattern, and then jumped the pattern a little bit, right? And that's what this Carrington event would have fallen in between here, right? It was a major magnetic storm, right? Okay, and so it's at this point that Mary and I sort of go off into very different directions. She starts building a timeline connecting some of the secret societies that she's been looking into in connection with possible sun worship and the worship of the ancient Canaanite gods, connecting it to the Carrington event and those floods, while I continued off following this modern line and looking at some of the more recent floods in Baltimore. And we kind of bounce that back and forth off each other along the way as well. But I just want to talk a little bit about what Mary's research really is, and someday we'll do a full slide presentation as an episode of Mudletting. But one of her big secret societies that she follows, and so who the Knights of the Golden Circle were, right? They were a secret society, right? And what our public knowledge of this secret society is that they were a group whose objective was to increase the power of the Southern slave-holding upper class to such a degree that it could never be dislodged, right? That's the surface of them. But for me, the name says it all. The Golden Circle. What's the Golden Circle? It's sun worship. And again, this is part of what Mary's research is all about, connecting these solar cycles and these secret societies to the events of our history as they're presented to us in this false paradigm. All right, and their seal, the Knights of the Golden Circle seal, looks like this. And so now, again, all of this is why we're going to have to do a full Mudletting episode on this. But, she ties this seal, this cross, to a lot of different other secret organizations. But not only that, to the probability of what a single photon of light looks like, which is this, right? Single photon of light is this cross, which is the cross on so many secret societies and religious orders and so forth, right? The light, the white light, the Sophia, right? Here it is on this, right? Really amazing. And so this is the slide that she was working on, right? And she was putting this together during our phone conversation, right? The red line across the top represents the floods that we were talking about, right? And it does show some sort of pattern with no record of any floods earlier than 1786. And of course, there must have been floods. We have a 41-year gap between floods here, so we don't know which part of the cycle this could be in. Right? Again, with no earlier record. Right? So 41 years, right? And then we get a 20-year, right? And so it's between this and the next flood that the Knights of the Golden Circle are formed in 1854, right? And their involvement in the Know Nothing riots. So, she's putting all this together while we're talking, connecting her Golden Circle and their involvement in these certain conspiracies and plots, tying it into some of the things that I was talking about following the storm forward, right? Because this article goes on to talk about that during Hurricane Agnes in 1972, there was a lot of concern over the dam, over the Lake Roland Dam, which at that point in 1972 was 111 years old. If the dam broke, no one knew what would happen to the land below Lake Avenue and all the way to Pratt Street. All right, so now at this time, you wouldn't know this unless you lived here and looked into the history. The Jones Falls in downtown Baltimore has been covered. They covered it up. And so we'll look here on Google Earth, right? And so this highway is where the Jones Falls is, right? And under the highway, they have it like capped off as well in most areas. And then it does eventually dump into the Inner Harbor. I don't know if this was their solution to the problem or anything, but in this Hidden Waters blog, again, thank you, Mary. She provided this for me. Here's a shot of what kind of remains of Jones Falls heading down into the Inner Harbor. Or maybe this could even be heading away from the Inner Harbor, I don't know. But it illustrates that the highway is above it, right? And when we look at it in Google Earth, right, this is the Jones Falls, right? And it's covered over by the highway, dumping into the Inner Harbor here. In 1915, the Fallsway, an urban boulevard, was constructed along 1¼ miles atop the waterway. between Penn Station and East Fayette Street. What is Penn Station today would be here, right? And the 1.25 mile stretch would be this right here. They just covered over it, right? City officials celebrated the burial of Jones Falls in March 1915 in the most unique fashion. I wonder if that was on the Ides of March. I bet it was. Right? They had a working dinner in the completed tunnel. Right? Members of the Sewage Commission and American Society of Civil Engineers. Here's a picture of it. They threw themselves a big old feast on the Ides of March when they covered Jones Falls. And so now after this Hurricane Agnes in 1972, and they're talking about the dam at Lake Roland, and how unsafe it is, right? In the late 70s, they try to get something going to repair and fix the dam. Right? But I guess they couldn't get it off the ground, and in 1983, an Army Corps of Engineers report warns that the dam was seriously inadequate to meet a probable maximum flood. That is, one of such magnitude that it would only be expected to occur once in 10,000 years. That's a long time. So it says, so the article closes with this question: just which of those 10,000 years will be the one in which the waters rise? Will it be 1993? And so after reading that, I had to wonder, did they ever actually do the repairs on this dam? That's kind of a big deal, especially knowing, because we were talking about the Carrington event and solar cycles, and that we were entering into a grand minimum now, right? Isn't that right? Yes, the solar minimum is coming. No, it's not going to mess things up, right? Sure, it's not. Right? The sun is asleep. Right? The grand solar minimum will lead to terrestrial cooling. Right? Things are about to get a whole lot cooler. Somebody, I think, just said that in the news. I can't remember who. Right? So I did a little search. Could I find anything about them repairing the dam? And so what is today Lake Roland Park was at one point Robert E. Lee Park. Right? Of course, but that's changed. We all know why. Right? And sure enough, in the early 90s, 1992 anyway, safety officials detailed plans to repair Lake Roland Dam. Right? But after that, I could not find anything. I did some digging. There's only so far I could go. But, somewhere around 2010, 2011, Baltimore City leased that area to Baltimore County, and they did a major overhaul of it, created public parks and walkways. It's a lovely place to go spend an afternoon, have a picnic, and so forth. But while reading those articles, I couldn't find anything about them working on the dam, right? And I couldn't find anything about dam repair in the 90s or early 2000s either. Again, not to say that they haven't fixed it or that information isn't out there, but I couldn't find it. And that's kind of frightening when you consider what would happen in Baltimore City today were there a flood, right? Because in our conversation, Mary and I were talking about this, and she found this image of what Baltimore City could look like under flood today, right? This is at Jones Falls. This is the same area. This is what it would look like today. And for a little perspective on that, this is Federal Hill Park here. All right, so we have Federal Hill Park here, right? And this is all underwater. All right, this is the Jones Falls, all of this underwater. Here's that grid structure that's in it, all of this underwater. All right, there's that grid, all underwater. Here, absolutely unbelievable. All right, so I'm going to do two parts with this, actually, because I have a whole other thing I want to do. All right, so just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lie. All right, and we'll see you in part 2. Cheers, guys.